Hey, welcome back. My guest this segment is Philip DeMont. He's a freelance business and economics writer. Philip, welcome to the show.
What's the word, hummingbird?
So, Philip, I wanted to tackle an issue here that is of extreme interest to everybody in capital markets across the country, and that is the Supreme Court has given the green light for a unified pan-Canadian securities regulator to govern the country's financial industry. People in some quarters are quaking in their boots, and in other quarters they're cheering from the rafters. Which should we be as retail investors?
Well, I mean, to some degree, if as a retail investor, what you want to be is happy with a single regulator if you get it, because it's not obvious you're going to get it. They've been trying since 1934. They've had references to the Supreme Court before, which didn't work out, because fundamentally the Constitution works against a single regulator in some sense. So they came up with this cooperative idea, and people have to sign on. So you've got everybody signed on except Alberta and Quebec, and you've got politics in play. That's why we didn't get it before. That's why we might not get it this time. For an investor, though, I've never been a big fan of provincial regulators, not because they're not well-meaning people, but there tends to be a bias. Nova Scotia has a regulator, absolutely fine people. But when you go down there as a company and you kind of say, well, we want to list in this certain way because we can't list on the TSX, okay, we might kind of accommodate you a little bit. Like, not necessarily throw the dog out, but it's a bit like, okay, if you're an investor down in Nova Scotia at one of those stocks, you got to kind of go, okay, am I sophisticated enough to play it's a shell company doing this and blah, blah, blah. The OSC, the TSX, you could kind of go, or even the Quebec Exchange by itself, you could kind of go, these guys play hardball. I can kind of be protected. Vancouver, when the VSE was up, little more of a close to the, you're slicing the cheese pretty close. And that becomes a bit of an issue. So if you're an individual investor, but if you're a lister, you probably don't like the single regulator because essentially it'll devolve towards the OSC kind of regulations. That's kind of what they'll be looking at.
Okay, so essentially from an individual investor's perspective, it's a good thing, but from a listing issuer's perspective, it's complicated then?
Well, I mean, the problem always was, if I was a mining company with an odd kind of a situation, because if you were a straight up mining company, you'd go with the TSX to some degree. So you're out in Vancouver. The whole argument was you don't understand the mining industry in Ontario. So they started doing various kind of things. It's the equivalent of the MERB issue. Those kind of, we'll shell it this way, we'll do it this way, we'll do a bit of a reverse takeover. And that stuff's okay. Nobody's cheating or anything like that. But as an investor, I mean, I'd never go there. Because it's like, okay, the risk is I'm going to get skunked. And the upside, if I got a $1.50 stock, it might go to 4, but it might go to 0. So I'm a conservative investor. I go to the OSC or that kind of a situation because they're basically going to protect me, and I'm looking for 4 or 5%. I'm not looking for 50. If you're looking for 50, you go to the venture exchange, those kind of situations, and the listings are a little different. So that became kind of the situation. Alberta, Quebec. Quebec's more of a sovereignty issue. Alberta's more of a you don't understand our industry issue. The dog's kind of barking on that one.
I mean,
you just don't, it's going for a while, but everybody's kind of running from the same hymn book now a little bit. And if you're an individual investor, you really want to be protected because it's nice, I'm not an idiot, but I'll go out and read these prospectuses and kind of go, okay, I'm not quite seeing it. And then you'll talk to Steve or you'll talk to you and it's okay, here's what really is going on. But if I'm just doing it on the exchange,
Okay, so if Alberta and Quebec do not sign on to be governed by a single regulator, does that mean there will be no single regulator, or will we have a single regulator just X of Quebec and Alberta?
Well, I think there's two things going on. One, BC signed on, and they were always difficult before. So that's a plus on that side. The negative side is it used to be the Quebec nationalism issue. I don't think that's the issue anymore. Nationalism's kind of died in Quebec. They kind of raised the sovereignty flag because it's a little more of a domestic voting issue. It's the Alberta Exchange. And the problem is that if you think that Trudeau has not done enough on the pipeline issue, then what you can do if you're the Notley government is say, look, we need protection on, you don't understand our industry, so you can't force us into the single regulator. The flip side is that it's not really a high salient issue anymore. If I'm Notley in Alberta, I'm not going to trade pipeline movement for, okay, you didn't do anything in the pipeline, do something on the Alberta Stock Exchange or the stock exchange out there, or the regulator, do something on the pipelines. So just keep pushing on that. So you can make the argument that Alberta's the company or the province in the way, but I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to this. Does Trudeau want to do this before an election, which could make some sense, get it out of the way, or does he want to not take any risk in terms of any kind of a sovereignty fallout, do it after an election, and then you're pushing it off because you're rolling the ball down the road. You don't know when it actually stops.
Okay. So I'm thinking of all of the provincial regulators and all of the prospectuses I've looked at who, you know, occasionally there's omissions as to which province or territory companies get registered in. But in general, I find it difficult to detect the differences on a province-to-province basis in terms of securities regulation. So can you give me any examples of specific differences that are unique to certain provinces or groups of provinces?
Well, I'm not really thinking of specific regulations, but here's an example. Halifax, Nova Scotia used to have different incorporation regulations. It was cheaper to go, and basically the argument became, if you had whatever the fee was, a couple of people in an office, you could list in Nova Scotia. So all of a sudden, all these companies on the TSX were domiciled in Nova Scotia, even though all they had was me in an office.
Right.
And so it's that kind of a thing. And the problem isn't so much, again, these, you know, it's not like they're stupid and the only smart people are in Toronto or in Ottawa. It's more an issue of they're kind of fighting for sovereignty issues. So there used to be a push to have a maritime stock exchange because they viewed it as, you don't understand our market, it's better for capital listings. And my dad was a stockbroker for 1 million years. He kind of scratched his head at this and said, well, but it's not like Toronto people don't get on the phone. And so you get into this debate. So if I'm in Alberta, you know, you don't understand, we want to do these kind of reverse takeover vehicles, and it's easier to list. I kind of think it's not, just list the friggin' list.
Yeah, right.
And do it that way, because if not, you're going to ask a question. If you got 8 of the provinces on side, and Quebec's kind of out there because that's Quebec and you leave them alone, it's Alberta. Well, if I'm listing in Alberta but nowhere else, or that's kind of the argument, I'd be going, it's like being a state with open gun carry. Okay, I'll just stay in these states and stay out of those bars down there because they got guns.
Right.
And it's that kind of problem. Why would I walk into a place where they're going to be starting shooting at me, whereas I can go here and I can get some vehicle similar to whatever's out there, and I can do it in Toronto.
Okay, so it's been 80 years that the provinces have been fighting the feds. The feds want this. The provinces aren't necessarily supportive of it. Now we've got some broad-based support. How likely is it that this is actually going to go through this time?
Well, I mean, it's better than it was, partly because the late Jim Flaherty, he pushed it, and there's some momentum among finance. It's in a sense a non-partisan issue. You're not going to have a conservative finance minister that far from Bill Morneau or far from Michael Wilson in the old days or whoever it is. So there's much more push. The problem becomes is, you know, Trudeau's not that popular right now. He's looking to try to win an election next year. So does this become an issue he can hang any kind of a hat on? I mean, here'd be a political way to look at it. Investors, Bay Street tends to be conservative. So if I'm a liberal government, am I going to do this for you? Am I going to get, okay, you might not vote for me. Am I going to get money out of you? Can I go down to Bay Street and have a fundraiser and have a bunch of people give me some dough? If not, it's kind of, you know, like I was a political guy for a while. I'd be saying, no, go where the money is or your votes are. Don't go where they're not going to vote for you, not give you money and give them something. Don't do it.
Right.
Because you got a million things you're going to fight on.
Right.
And, you know, for Bay Street, it's like, well, why wouldn't he? It makes perfect sense. Yeah, but he's fighting pipelines and he's fighting native, you know, issues. He's fighting a bunch of stuff. So he puts it in a different mixer. So for Bay Street, it's a one issue, and like, why wouldn't they do this? But then at the same time, they want to reduce the deficit. They say, well, you can't have both. You want the deficit, you want this. It's that kind of an issue.
Interesting. Okay, so then are there any industries that would benefit from this amalgamation of governance across the country relative to other ones?
Well, I mean, one thing you could look at is some of the softer kind of issues we look at, and you don't really think of those regulatory issues. Climate change, women on boards, for instance, diversity. Because with a single regulator, let's take climate change. You dumped cap and trade, which I think was kind of dumb because it's a market-based solution to that problem. Okay, so now all of a sudden you've got regulatory concerns about what cleanup, let's say the Alberta oil well cleanups are going to cost. So you need to kind of list that kind of an idea. So what they're going to kind of do with those kind of regulations, if you have a single regulator, is you're going to have to list this stuff. You're going to have to go and figure out what it's going to cost, and you're going to have to list it. Everybody's going to have to list it. So if I'm buying from Oil Driller 1 and there's a future cost that government's going to make me pay for cleaning up the oil wells, okay, I know it's $100 million in 2025. But you know, this other guy's not going to get away with not being able to do it.
Okay.
So transparency, because one of the troubles with transparency, it might be nice to say you're transparent, but if I'm not, then I kind of win. So you're going to force people to be transparent on those kind of issues. Women on boards, I mean, I've always been confused by this because every time you see women CEOs, women on boards, you do better. Fundamentally, your returns are higher. But male companies tend not to do that. Okay, governments are saying, smarten up, we'll put it in a regulation. You got to disclose your boards, you got to blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And then you force them to do it, and everybody goes, and it's easy, then you can go back to your shareholders who might, a bunch of male shareholders might bitch about putting, oh, we got too many women on the board, but well, the regulator made us do it.
Right.
It's kind of like gay marriage in the States. Every state opposed it, but they knew they were going to get overthrown because the Supreme Court already ruled. It's that kind of thing. The regulator tells me to do this. Sorry, guys, got to kind of do it. So, you don't like climate change, don't really care. Regulator tells me to do it.
Right. Phil, that's great input. Thanks very much for joining us today. We'll have you back soon.
Terrific. Thank you.